I don't know if there's a single podcast out there right now that does not like looking at all of the reviews and stats and data and positive feedback about their own show. What if there was a place that curated all of that good data, all of that goodness about your show, and presented to you in a nice little package? Well, now there is.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? Thank you so much for being here. I am Chris, and this is Podtastic Audio, the show which I've designed and created to help you, yes, you, and other podcasters just like you, make an amazing show for your audience. And that is what it's all about. You create the awesomeness, you create your amazing podcast, and then you distribute it out to your listening audience, and everybody's happy. It's a big, giant win-win for everybody. But how do you know whether or not your audience that listens to your show really, truly enjoys your show? Well, one would say that possibly they could leave a rating or review, an honest rating and review, not a fake one, but an actual, true, honest one. But where do you leave it? Do you leave it on Apple Podcasts? Or do you leave it on Spotify or on Podchaser or on Good Pods or on fill in the blank, all the different ones? I'm sure there's a bunch out there I don't know about. But what if there was an easy, real easy place to track all this data and put it in front of you in a nice, easy to look at package that looks great for maybe your website or to share on social media? Like, check out all my reviews and all my cool stuff. Check all this out. Like a media kit that's created for you based on your podcast. Well, there is. Welcome to Podgagement. Now, Podgagement is a platform that allows you to take your podcast and have it curate all of these fantastic reviews and all this stuff and package it all for you right there in one easy place. Making it easy for you to actually just do what you do best, is creating amazing content. And don't worry about tracking down reviews or tracking down where all this stuff is or putting everything together. So to make sense of all of this stuff, I've invited Daniel J. Lewis on the show today, the creator of Podgagement. We're going to talk all about podcasting, what it means to be an indie podcaster like most of us are. This whole new thing of podcasting 2.0. What is it? Is it even worth its time? And of course, talking all about Podgagement and how it can help you better your podcast and make sure that you are doing the right thing when it comes to delivering the amazing content for your audience. Daniel J. Lewis, the legendary Daniel J. Lewis. Now I believe you are a Hall of Famer in the podcasting community. Is that right?
Yes, it's a huge honor to be that. And also a huge honor to be talking with you too, Chris. We've interacted through X Twitter for months, and to actually get to talk voice to voice is great.
This is great, man. This is fantastic. I knew I first discovered your podcast probably along the way. A lot of other podcasters have also discovered your podcast, was because when I first got started in podcasting, I use Audacity. Yeah. And I was like, well, maybe there's a podcast about Audacity. And then you plug those two things into your search field, and Audacity, your show comes up. And that's how I listened to, I think it was one of your episodes, or the two-part episode you did. I think it was on how to podcast or something like that. I don't remember when you recorded that or when you released it, but I remember that was the first time I ever listened to you.
Mm. Yeah, I worked hard on that SEO aspect of the title. I always wanted the title to have that double meaning, that I wanted the SEO benefit for anyone looking for how to podcast with Audacity. So the title, The Audacity to Podcast, helps rank well with that search. But also the title has always really had the meaning of the guts, the courage, the power to podcast. So I like having that double meaning. It keeps me out of trademark trouble as well. And it really lays the foundation for the future of what I'm most passionate about in podcasting.
So when did you first get started with podcast? That was your first podcast, was it?
No, I started listening to podcasts in '05 when iTunes 4.9 came out with support for podcasts. That was my first introduction to what a podcast even is. And I was immediately hooked because I had a long commute. I was tired of what was on popular terrestrial radio. And I love the world of podcasts where anyone could talk about anything and their podcast could be about only that one subject. And that just had me hooked because I didn't like always hearing sports and local news and financial talk or the typical things you hear on terrestrial radio. So right from that start, as soon as I started listening, I thought, I could do this. I could have my own podcast. I want to have a podcast someday too. And I was thinking back then, I really like making people laugh. I'd like to have a comedy podcast and make people laugh through comedy because I was a bachelor then and am again now. And there were a lot of funny things that happened in my life being a bachelor and out on my own for the first time and all of that. But it took me 2 years to actually launch my podcast because I had all of these ideas in my mind. I was obsessed with perfection. I wasn't quite sure how I wanted to do it. And it was finally just hearing from a couple people at the same time who basically said the same thing, just start. And so I did. I still struggled with perfection for a couple of years after that too, but just finally starting. So it was in '07 that I launched my first podcast, which was a clean comedy podcast called The Ramen Noodle.
Nice. Why that name?
Well, because I was a bachelor, and the common thing with bachelors is ramen noodles.
Yeah, it's like that mac and cheese.
Oh yeah, and originally the podcast was actually called Bachelor Chronicles, but that didn't quite communicate the comedy aspect of it, and also communicated some other things I didn't intend. But I always knew that I wanted ramen noodles somehow part of the branding because that's such a signature thing of bachelors. And so I started thinking like, will work for ramen noodles or ramen comedy, and then I just had this thought of, hey, what if my identity is I am the ramen noodle? And that be the name of the podcast is The Ramen Noodle. Like that's a title for a person, or it is a person itself. And that's how it came about. And it carried that name through all of the years that I did that podcast until I retired it.
Nice. So when you first started it, iTunes, they introduced the podcasting in the iTunes store at that point, right?
Yeah. iTunes had already been around with support for podcasts for about 2 years at that point.
Now, that was the point I think that most regular people probably got introduced to some kind of a podcast.
Yes.
And that's probably when Apple or somebody coined the name podcast from iPod, I'm assuming, but I don't know if that's quite clear. Can you make the determination whether or not that was actually the point where podcast came from?
There's some different information on it, but really it was back in 2004 when it was called podcasting and a podcast. And that is the portmanteau of iPod, because back then that's what people were using to listen to these things. And that was the most popular portable media player at that time. This was before the iPhone. We have to remember that. So it was iPod and broadcast. So you put those together, you get podcast. And that name has stuck. Some people even tried to change the name to things like webcast and netcast, because at some point there was a concern that Apple might go after people for trademark infringement because it borrowed from iPod. But at some point that was released because Apple clearly said, no, we are not claiming trademark over the term podcast. And so it's been called a podcast to this day. And now some people are trying to redefine what a podcast is.
Can you imagine if Apple claimed the name podcast? It was only their brand name. What would that be like today? Would it be like everybody had to use an iPod, an iPhone to listen to a podcast?
Well, that was the problem back then, is people would hear pod in podcast and they would think, oh, I don't have an iPod. I can't listen to a podcast. And it's funny how now that's not even a concern. People don't even think about iPods anymore or even have an iPod. They just hear the word podcast and they don't even think, oh, I need a particular device for that. Now we're battling against different false impressions, but it's fascinating how that has changed over the years.
So what do you think is like the biggest challenge for maybe an indie podcaster? Because the industry has grown up so much since those days in 2007. There's so many big players in the game. But how does an indie podcaster today, like how do they stand out? How do they grow their show today?
It's interesting that as an industry, they often talk about there's a podcast discovery problem. But I think that's both true and false, because it really depends on which perspective you're looking at podcast discovery. Most of the people who say there's a podcast discovery problem are saying that because their podcast is not being discovered. But the average audience member out there is not thinking, if only there was a podcast I could discover. There's no discovery problem to the audience. The problem is for the podcaster, and especially for the indie podcaster, because the big name podcasts have huge marketing budgets that they can spend on these things. They've got huge reach and potential and connections in the industry with other people who have large followings, and they can leverage all of those connections and all of that. But we indies don't have that. We don't have the dollars. We probably don't have the connections. What we have is passion for niches. And that's what I think indie podcasters need to embrace, not trying to be the next Joe Rogan or the next Serial podcast or the next whatever popular podcast is out there, but embrace your niche. I think it was the way that Apple said it is something like, here's to the weird ones, or something like that. Originally, in their whole branding for Apple was like, we're for the people who don't fit into other boxes or typical boxes. We're for the creative people, the creative types, the weird ones. Embrace your weirdness in that aspect with your podcast of what makes you unique, what makes your approach to this subject unique. Sometimes even simply that subject is unique because maybe no one else is doing a podcast about that. There's a video game that I've been a fan of for a while, and I've looked online and discovered that at one point there were no active podcasts about that specific game. Plenty of YouTube channels, yes. Many of those YouTube channels could actually be podcasts because they weren't actually showing any good content. Often they were simply talking about content. But those are opportunities. If there's a movie franchise or a book franchise you're a fan of, you could make a podcast about that. A lot of podcasters got their start on making TV show fan podcasts. And that has huge potential even still, because there are new TV shows and more people are familiar with the concept of there being after show podcasts for their favorite TV shows, maybe just talking about the shows, highlighting certain moments, making fun of the shows even, sometimes digging deep into the theories of the shows, like with Lost, Once Upon a Time, Fringe, and other shows like that have this deep lore and mystery to them. And that kind of stuff, that taps into people's weird sides, their nerdy, geeky sides, where they really get deep into something. And as indie podcasters, we can do that because we're not thinking about, I need to have an idea that will appeal to millions of people. What we're often thinking about is, I have an idea that will be fun and will connect me with other people who will have fun too. I talk about the idea of profit, Profit, and it's the ways that both you as the podcaster and your audience need to benefit from your podcast. And Profit stands for popularity, relationships, opportunities, fun, income, and tangibles. And you could benefit any one of those ways from your podcast. So it doesn't always have to be about money. It could simply be the fun in it, the fun you have and the fun that your community has.
Yeah, I think when you are an indie podcaster, or at least a hobbyist podcaster like most of us are here, that fun has got to be like the number one factor when we even created a podcast. It would be nice if we get paid to do this too, but I think when you start focusing more on the monetization side of podcasting, kind of sucks some of the fun out of it, really, if you ask me.
It can, yeah, because then you start thinking of your audience in terms of dollar amounts or pennies and really thinking, oh, I need a bigger audience so that I can make more money. And then we start to lose focus instead of like, I want a bigger audience so that I get more feedback, or so that we can get more people having fun with this, or so that I can impact more people for good with whatever your podcast, however it serves them and your vision for your podcast or any of that. Bringing on sponsors or focusing on the money then it has to change that focus really, because to make a profitable podcast, you have to look at it as a business. And when it's a business, then you really have to think about the bottom line. Ultimately, businesses still need to focus on how they serve their customer, because otherwise there would be no business. But they also have to think about the bottom line. And as indie podcasters, you don't have to look at it that way. It might someday become that, but it doesn't have to be that, like it does have to be for the big podcasters, the NPRs and such.
Right. I think that indie podcasters probably do work best if they narrow down to a particular niche or particular subject matter of something that they're passionate about, that they know a lot about, versus trying to be the next morning radio show. I know a lot of shows do that, and I'm guilty of that myself. It's because when I first got into podcasting, that's all I knew. Like, I knew of morning radio, so I was like, well, I guess that's how podcasting is, because I listened to a lot of like morning radio podcasts. So I didn't listen to a lot of these deep niche-filled podcasts. It was more just like a broad general stuff, like a Joe Rogan type of stuff. And I know a lot of shows try to be just like Joe Rogan, and there's some shows that even try to mimic the exact same stuff, talking about the same stuff he's talking about. And they're thinking like, why isn't my show growing? Well, first off, you're not Joe Rogan.
Right.
You know, and secondly, they've got massive budgets. I mean, they've got, also, speaking of Joe Rogan, like I would listen to Joe Rogan's show if it was just Joe Rogan. Like, he doesn't have to have a guest. And a lot of these podcasters will come on, they'll do their show, but there are interview-only shows. Well, those only do interviews. That's all they do. Well, I'm talking interesting people, but interesting things and blah, 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 whatever. Now, I told this to another podcaster on Threads the other day. I'm going to tell you right now, because he mentioned this about doing solo shows versus doing interview shows. And I said, interview-only podcasters, I probably get a lot of hate for this, but I say interview-only podcasters, it's a crutch. It's a crutch for podcasters that have no talent.
Those are fighting words, but
I know they are.
There is a lot of truth to that, though.
Yeah. I mean, I did interview shows too on the Chris Christine show. We did a ton of interviews, and I thought they were easy peasy. I mean, yeah, you got to ask them a few questions, get the conversation rolling, that kind of stuff. But you let the guest do all the heavy lifting. I mean, you ask them a couple questions, but you get the guest do a lot of heavy lifting. So it's so much harder to like create something from scratch all by yourself with no crutch, no guest to lean on, no co-host to lean on, just you doing your thing for however long your episode is. It's much harder to pull that off than to do an interview show. Said it, meant it. There you go.
And I think it really goes back to, why do people want to do the interview show? Like, you look at the people who have successful interview-based podcasts, and the reason they do the interviews is because they are genuinely fascinated and curious about these stories from these people, whatever their focus is on these things. Like, you look at Beyond the To-Do List with Eric J. Fisher. He used to be on a podcast network that I used to run, and he wants to talk about productivity, but not just productivity tools. It's stuff beyond the to-do list, as you can tell from the name. It's like the mindset of productivity. And he's fascinated with that. And he's curious how other people are thinking that enables them to get things done. And so that's what his podcast focuses on. Or you look at other podcasts that interview people around certain things because they're so curious and they're like, I really want to talk to people about this. I really want to highlight these stories around this thing. John Lee Dumas, also with Entrepreneurs on Fire, or EO Fire, he started that because he was thinking, I really want to hear this information from a whole bunch of entrepreneurs. I want these tidbits of inspiration. This is what I want to hear. And so he made that podcast that he wanted to hear. And it turns out a lot of other people wanted to hear it too. Those are successful interview-based podcasts. Some people, though, I think do look at it as a crutch. They think, I'm not so sure about doing a solo podcast, so I know what I'll do. I'll interview other people. I'll just find interesting people and we'll talk about, I don't know, movies and stuff, or we'll figure something out to talk about.
It'll be random people. Yeah. It's anybody with a pulse on the show. It should be a podcast called Anybody with a Pulse, come on the show, or whatever.
It probably is.
That's the thing, because I've been on shows like that. Well, I was on a guest on a show once. It was a show kind of like that, I think. And the interview was horrible. He never told me the episode got released. I don't know. The show might have pod faded for all I know. But I could tell he was kind of nervous. And then he was asking just a list of questions. And then he was asking me questions. And then he went straight to the list of questions. And he asked me a question he asked me like 4 questions ago.
Oh, yeah.
The same question, word for word. I'm like, well, I already answered that question like a minute ago, but here you go again, you know? So, but I see where a lot of people that they feel like they can't hold, or they got nothing important to say. So I'm going to bring on somebody that does have something important to say, because I myself isn't that important. I myself isn't that knowledgeable in whatever the topic is. So I will bring experts on. I'll ask them some questions that, get the ball rolling, and we'll let them be the expert. The only problem with that is that if your show is trying to position you as the expert to get them to sign up for your coaching classes or whatever you're selling, they may not even care or even know you even have that stuff, because you're positioning the guest as the expert, not you.
Right. Unless your approach to the guest, and this takes very intentional work on your part, but if your approach to the guest is a sellable skill, then you can monetize that, like Jordan Harbinger does with the Jordan Harbinger Show, and where then he teaches people how to network, how to build relationships and such, like he is demonstrating in his podcast. But he's done that with very intentional and designed skills in those areas.
Right. And I think a lot of indie podcasters that jump on first time using a microphone, we're gonna do a Zoom show and interview whatever people and stuff. And some people might have some skills from their daily job. Maybe they're HR and they're used to the hiring process or management or whatever, things like that. And that's skills like that do transfer over. But some people that come into podcasting, their regular job might be flipping burgers at McDonald's.
Sure.
And they come in and they want to be an interview expert type of show. And that's fine. You can do whatever you want. Anybody can podcast about anything they want. Go right ahead, have at it. Speaking of podcasting though, Daniel, I was going to ask you, what are your thoughts on like having to have video for your podcast versus audio? Is it as important as everybody keeps preaching about these days?
That goes to the question, what is a podcast? Coming soon from Matt Walsh. But that is the big question right now, is what really is a podcast? And we talked about earlier how people used to think, oh, I have to have an iPod to listen to that. Now some people are starting to think, oh, that's YouTube. And much of the reason people are thinking that is because people on YouTube are calling their shows podcasts. And so that is just starting to confuse people, I think. But here's the thing is, the word podcast is really a label for a particular distribution method. It is not a description of a type of show. Some survey came out about a year ago or so that some people thought that what made a podcast is when you see people sitting around a table, talking into microphones, wearing headphones, that is what a podcast is.
Interesting.
So that's like format. That's not even format. That's more like just how you are physically positioned and what is in the shot. That is not what makes a podcast or something else. What I would love for us content creators to do is more just think of it as we make shows. We make talk shows or drama shows or whatever. These are shows, and we distribute them in different ways. Like even someone who calls themselves a YouTuber, I don't like that either, because I think, well, if you call yourself a YouTuber, what if you want to do something other than YouTube? What if you want to put your show on Amazon Prime? Are you then a Primer? Or what if you get bought out by Netflix? Are you a Netflixer? Or what are you? Are you a Huluer? Or, don't tie your branding or your identity to the platforms or the tools you use, or even to the distribution method. Now, I think with podcasting, though, it is a little bit separate because of all of these other common methods of consuming media. They are all tied to one specific platform. YouTube videos you get from YouTube. Yes, people can embed them on their websites, but it's still a YouTube video.
Yeah, it lives on YouTube. It doesn't go anywhere else.
And shows like Stranger Things, it's a Netflix show. It is only on Netflix. And now Disney Plus has certain Disney shows that are only on Disney Plus and may never come to DVD or Blu-ray. And that's disappointing. But that's their new model now, is entertainment as a service. So each of these kinds of other shows are tied to one platform. Well, podcasting is separate from that, because with a podcast, you can get a podcast, whatever podcast you want pretty much, in one of probably 200 apps, or maybe even more at this point, out there that you could use on dozens of different kinds of devices. You could consume the same podcast through your iPhone and then listen to it or watch it through your TV or your smart speaker. Or with this latest version of watchOS and the Apple Watch that was recently announced, you could even listen to a podcast through your watch without your phone. There are certain earbuds out there where you can upload audio to the earbud and listen to that audio, whether it be a podcast, music, or an audiobook. Listen to that without any other devices with you, only your earbuds. So this is content that could be consumed almost anywhere through any device, through hundreds of different apps. And that is what's unique about podcasting.
Speaking of podcasting, the new latest buzzword in the podcasting space has got to be this thing called podcasting 2.0. Hey, I'm still wondering what 1.0 even was, but now we're on to 2.0. Can you explain what 2.0 is and like what kind of benefits does it have for the podcaster and the listener themselves?
Yeah, it really first comes back to technically what is a podcast. And a podcast is downloadable media syndicated through an RSS feed. At its simplest form, that is technically what a podcast is. And the reason I have to bring that up is that the RSS feed, the technology that makes podcasting possible, has had limitations for years. And those limitations have more just been the result of one company, Apple, pretty much setting the standard for what other podcasts did, and no one really innovating on that. But RSS, I have to get technical here. RSS is a particular flavor of XML code. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. And it's that extensible part that means we can make RSS feeds do more than they currently do. That's where podcasting 2.0 comes along, to extend what is possible through the technical distribution method of podcasting so that podcasting apps can start supporting new standards. And these are features that really benefit everyone from all sides of podcasting. It benefits the audiences, the podcasters, the developers, both the app developers and the distribution developers, and it can even benefit the advertisers. So some of these features, just to cherry pick a few of them, and some of my favorites are like making an audio podcast more engaging for someone looking at their device, making it so that they can see a picture that you're talking about in your audio podcast without having to give video, making it so they can more easily review your notes, making it so people can follow along in a transcript word by word as they're listening, maybe for accessibility reasons or for retention or understanding reasons, or to review something, or certain automation tools that can come out of that. It could also be stuff like comments, and this is something that's still being developed, but a way that your audience can engage with you, back with you through their podcast app, as well as engaging with other listeners who might be using different podcasting apps or podcast apps, and ways that they can build community then and those relationships with other audience members, all without leaving the podcast app that they're currently in. And these are the kinds of things that Podcasting 2.0 is laying this technical foundation for, so that these apps and development and publishing platforms can start supporting these features.
Now, when you said the comments in the chat, now would this be able to do any kind of like live stream podcasting and then chat live like that too, like YouTube does?
Absolutely. We already have a live tag, which for Podcasting 2.0 enabled apps like Cast-O-Matic, Podcast Guru, TrueFans, a few others out there. What this could allow them to do is when you want to live stream your recording, it's not technically live podcasting because of the whole technical definitions of things, but if you want to call it live podcasting, okay, go ahead. But you could then send out a little signal that then on people's devices inside their podcast apps, it could say, hey, Podtastic audio is going live. Tap here to listen right now. And they tap it, it's in their podcast app. They start listening live to you. And there might be even a chat room right there in their podcast app. And that is your official chat room, but being pulled into the podcasting app. So they're bringing all this engagement and interaction into the podcast app. And that's what's so beautiful, that people might not have to go visit a web page to consume something or to engage, but they can do it all right there inside their app because of what's being enabled with Podcasting 2.0.
It sounds like we kind of have some of that stuff already with Instagram Live and things of that sort. So it does kind of the same thing, but you're talking about on a podcast app that could be distributed, whatever podcast app you're on that supports Podcasting 2.0, of course, where Instagram, you have to be on Instagram and an Instagram account for that to happen. But it's kind of the same thing, right?
Yeah, it's very close to it. But the nice thing is, like with Instagram, you have to be on Instagram and that's your only option. But with Podcasting 2.0 and how the distribution and consumption of podcasting is very decentralized, someone could be on TrueFans, which is a web app for podcasts, and someone else could be in Cast-O-Matic, but they can be engaging with each other and engaging at the same moment with the live podcast at the same time, even though they are in different apps.
That's fantastic. Now, do you see this being more beneficial for audio podcasts, or think video podcasts too, or they wouldn't care?
Well, from a technical perspective, video podcasts aren't very popular anymore because YouTube stole the video show. A lot of people are trying to call YouTube stuff video podcasts. But regardless of that debate over definitions and technical things, there are ways that this can even tie in with video content, whether that's video in true podcast form or video on YouTube, because there are new things that we're being able to do, like an audio feed that can indicate that there is an alternative format of this same content, and that alternative format is video. So someone could theoretically then be listening to the podcast and then decide, no, I really want to watch the podcast. So they tap a button to switch over to the video version, and it jumps right to where they were listening. And now they're suddenly seeing it and downloading the video or streaming the video. And then maybe they decide, I want to go back to audio only. So they switch back to the audio version. It streams only the audio, so it's not using up a lot of energy in it or bandwidth. And they're able to switch back and forth because of what's possible inside the RSS feed through Podcasting 2.0. And some of the things, like we're recording right now through only audio. I can't see you at all. We're not even recording the video to publish video, but maybe the live experience for someone could include video, or maybe someone is publishing the video and they could then watch inside their podcast app, watch live, comment live, and see things, even if the podcast is usually only audio.
It's going to take a lot of bandwidth to pull it off, right?
Well, some of these things are using bandwidth from certain other providers. Like some of the stuff that I'm advocating for is, hey, let's remember to support other tools like YouTube Live. And it is very possible to embed a YouTube video inside a podcast app. So if you were doing YouTube Live, then you could very easily bring that live video, even though it's distributed and streamed through YouTube, you could bring that into the podcast app. So then you're using YouTube's distribution bandwidth, but whoever is consuming that on their device would be then consuming the bandwidth of a video. And that's where they have to consider, just like they would anytime they're watching a video or listening to audio, they have to think about any kind of bandwidth restrictions that they may have. But most people would probably be somewhere on Wi-Fi to be able to sit still and watch or listen. Yes, there's some of the commuters who are maybe riding a bus or a train, and that's where really the podcast format, downloadable media, is so great, because you might not get a Wi-Fi signal in a train or on a plane, not in a boat, not on a goat, not with a mouse,
Yes.
not in a house.
Dr. Seuss.
Yeah. So you might not get Wi-Fi in those places, but you can take a pre-downloaded podcast into those places.
Well, it's like an airplane too. I mean, I went on a couple big flights this summer, and I was able to download some movies to my tablet, and of course they've got the Wi-Fi in the plane for whatever selected content they have. But yeah, I think it's one thing that separates like an actual podcast you can download versus like a YouTube video. I think you can download YouTube stuff, but that's only on the premium package if I know.
Yes. Yeah,
So-
with YouTube Red.
Right. So that kind of sucks with that, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I love podcasting, I love audio, probably because I consume more of it. I think it's also, I noticed with the indie podcasters is that they seem to create the thing they consume the most. So if they're consuming a lot of like video, like YouTube and I guess YouTube and Netflix and all that kind of stuff, I think they kind of start to lean towards the video style show more than the audio style show, that I could tell, but I could be wrong. But I think we all kind of seem to fill into whatever we're comfortable with, and whatever we consume is what we like. If you like barbecue, you probably would cook barbecue.
Yeah.
It's kind of the way things go. So basically, the one thing I really heard about podcasting 2.0 was that it's all about this value for value thing where you can give cash directly to the content creators instantly through the app. That's always been through like some kind of Bitcoin cryptocurrency kind of thing. And I'm not a big fan of cryptocurrency. I like cold hard cash, American dollars, That's how I roll. That's what I spend my money on, really. But will there ever evolve to regular money through value for value?
There are some difficulties with that, because in order to process payments, at least right now in the industry, the general industry standard is that there's not only a percentage rate of a fee taken from any transferred payment, but there's also often a per transaction fee. Like you look at PayPal and their fee is something like 2.9% plus 49 cents. So if someone wanted to send you 50 cents through PayPal, well, you can't really do that. PayPal is going to eat all of that. And that's the idea of micropayments. And that's where some of this stuff with streaming Satoshis, which is a very small portion of Bitcoin, comes in, where you don't have those per transaction fees. And what I'd really love to see is what I've predicted will happen in podcasting. And I think we've seen this happen multiple times through the different stages of podcasts and podcasting, is that the technology will disappear. So even if we are using cryptocurrency to enable people to send payments to each other through podcasting apps, or to automatically stream a certain amount of money for every minute of your podcast that I listen to, or things like that, that it might use cryptocurrency on the back end, but neither you nor the audience have to care about that. Maybe you just know it as, hey, I've bought 1,000 tokens for $5. I can send these tokens to whatever podcast I listen to. Then those podcasters can redeem those tokens back to dollars. They're not stuck with those tokens like you are at a arcade or something like that.
Right.
But they could then redeem that back to dollars at whatever the current rate is. And who cares what those tokens actually are? It's just a method of getting money from one place to another. Maybe the industry will change so that those processing fees will make those microtransactions easier. And what I mean by microtransactions, we could actually almost call nanotransactions, because sometimes it might be a couple of pennies per minute. And that might not sound like much, but it's actually a lot more valuable than podcast advertiser might be.
Right. Yeah. I just, the whole Bitcoin and the whole cryptocurrency thing, it sounds very confusing, I think, for most people, which is probably a lot of people haven't adopted to it.
Right.
And if you try to throw that into podcasting 2.0, and if most people see that being the only thing associated with podcasting 2.0, they're like, what do I need that for? I don't need that. I don't need that. Like it's a big waste of time, especially when you get other players like Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee and probably other ones I don't know about that are out there too, that kind of do somewhat of the value for value on at least a surface level. Anyways, you got to go through their app and their thing. But at the end of the day, you're still giving money to the creator.
Yeah, and the goal here is to really integrate all of this into the podcast app itself. Like you think of Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee or anything like that. First, I think a lot of podcasters are making a mistake of speaking those brand names to their audience and thus forever tying them to that brand name, or if they ever change in the future, invalidating their past calls to action. So I really recommend podcasters, if you use Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, anything like that, never speak that brand name. Instead, send your audience to a page or redirect on your domain, like a /support or /giveback or gift or whatever. Something on your domain that you can then redirect or make a page yourself or anything like that. So all your past calls to action can remain valid even if you switch tools in the future. But beyond that, that is a tool that is outside of the podcast app. If I want to support a podcast on Patreon, I am leaving the podcast app to do that. And then if that Patreon feed gives me something exclusive by supporting it, I have to do a bunch of extra things in order to get that extra content into my podcast app. Whereas the vision of Podcasting 2.0 is to keep all of this inside the podcasting app so that people who want to support the podcast can do that in the podcast app. And if that somehow unlocks some kind of bonus content, it can do that in the podcast app without their having to do all kinds of other things or switch to other websites or switch to a different podcast app. But it's all right there inside the app.
Now, does every podcast app have these capabilities, or only a certain few of them do?
They don't all have it yet. And there are some like Spotify who do not like podcasting standards and will probably never support even the simplest features of Podcasting 2.0. Some of these features, like when it comes to the cryptocurrency stuff, which is only one tiny aspect of this bigger idea that we call value for value, but some app developers and companies are never going to touch the cryptocurrency stuff. But we have seen Apple, Apple Podcasts, one of the top
big dog in podcasting, yeah.
They now support the Podcasting 2.0 transcript feature. And I am very hopeful that now that they support that, that will inspire other apps to not only support that same feature, but to also realize, there are all these other features I could easily start supporting in my app. As long as I'm building in support for this one Podcasting 2.0 feature, I could start supporting some of these others too. So I'm hopeful that it will start creating an avalanche of apps supporting these new features. And the more apps and podcasts that support these features and start demanding support for these features from the audiences and the podcasters, the more those popular apps will start to support them too. Like you look at Apple many years ago, when Serial first came out, there was no true crime category inside Apple Podcasts. But then Serial made this explosion of true crime podcasts, so much so that there was a demand for a whole category about true crime. And then Apple added a true crime category and some of these other things too, like how to handle a serialized podcast where you have to listen in a particular order, how to add episode numbers, and some of these other things have come about as a result of the need for them.
Yeah, well, with this all this podcasting 2.0 stuff, will the app have to get so like, can the app handle like everything you're talking about, or does it have to like just become a whole new app?
They can handle it because a lot of these things are simply an additional field in the RSS feed, like one line of code for some of these things. Transcripts are a little bit more difficult because it means downloading a separate file and then lining that up with the audio, but that's fairly easy for an app to do. Like a transcript, in this way that we do it in Podcasting 2.0 is not simply a text document with a huge block of text. It is time-stamped, and some transcripts can even be time-stamped down to the word, but most of them are time-stamped to a line of text. Just like if you've ever watched a movie or a show with closed captions on, you're not seeing a giant paragraph. You're seeing just phrase by phrase at a time as it's being spoken. That's how a transcript works because of the machine-readable format of it has these timestamps to know when it gets to 1 minute and 3 seconds in the audio, show this line at 1 minute and 3 seconds until 1 minute and 9 seconds, then show this next line. So the apps can handle that fairly easily. And some of these features are as simple as just exposing the information. Some of them take a little bit more work, but the nice thing is what this can mean for the app developers is it can mean a better app, a better experience for the audience. Like take another example, the person tag, as we call it, where you can indicate who is in your podcast, not just the author tag where you're simply writing the names and that's it, but the person tag can contain extra data, like the picture of the person, their name, a link that confirms their identity, something like that. So a little bit of data. And then what a podcast app can do is then when you tap on that person's name, you instantly see all the other podcasts that they host or all the other podcast episodes they've been a guest on because those other episodes have added that same data to that tag. And the apps can make that really easily to expose that. So like if you're a big fan of Harrison Ford and you want to see all the episodes he's ever been on, then you could tap on his name and then suddenly see all of that information as it's populated. And that is what the backend data is making possible to expose to the apps. So the apps then get a better experience for the consumers.
Fantastic, man. That sounds like a lot. And going back to the transcripts really quick here, I was going to ask you does the transcript itself in Apple Podcasts get searched in the search field at all? Does any that data get put in there? Like if you typed in something you said, it'll pull it up from that one podcast?
It does now work. For a while, it was only the top podcasts were getting automated transcripts, but Apple recently announced that all podcasts would get automatic transcripts. But there is a way that you can upload your own through using the Podcasting 2.0 transcript feature, and Apple will index those. And that is, I think, a great way to address this search issue that Apple over the years has changed certain things. And like, for example, for I think maybe almost forever, you could not actually find a podcast by words that were in its description. You could always find podcasts in almost every app by words that are in the podcast title. Most of the apps support the episode titles. Most of the apps support the author or the artist tag, like who hosts the podcast. So if you search for Daniel J. Lewis, you would find my podcast.
Right.
But not many apps support the description of the episode. And part of the reason for that is there are some people out there who start manipulating things and putting in things that, yeah, no way. People would try and cheat the system. Who would have ever imagined? But people do. Like an example of this, if you just search any podcast app for Zig Ziglar, who is dead, then you will find a lot of podcasts trying to capitalize on his name when maybe they've never interviewed him and maybe they never even talk about his content.
Well, it's the same thing with Taylor Swift, too. I mean, now that I mentioned Taylor Swift, a bunch of Swifties will hit this podcast up, I think. So
yeah, we'll get the big Travis Kelce money now.
Yeah, so you mentioned both. It's a double whammy. You get double. We actually did that on the Chris Christine show. We did an episode about Taylor Swift's new song or video years and years ago, and that episode did do fairly well. I thought I think about it. It was in the title, so I think that has something to do with it. So shifting gears here, Daniel, your new project you're working on is Podgagement. Now, what is Podgagement and what does it do?
I am passionate about helping podcasters engage their audiences and grow their podcasts. Because I think for most podcasters, if you were to ask them, what is the most fun thing about podcasting? They would probably say, oh man, it is engaging with my community. It's hearing back from the audience, getting to talk to these people, getting to see the change that I'm making in their lives, things like that. That's where the real profit is coming from for many of these podcasters. And at its core, that is engagement with their audience. And so Podgagement, coming from, it's another portmanteau, it is podcast engagement.
Watch out, Apple's coming for you.
Podgagement then builds on that and helps podcasters to engage their audiences through ratings and reviews, through receiving feedback, through networking with other podcasters, through collecting reviews directly from their audience, from searching for reviews and ratings in nearly 200 places, doing all of these things as ways to collect that engagement for podcasters so that they can use that in their podcasts. Maybe they read that feedback in their podcast. Maybe they even play voicemails from their audience in their podcast. That's something that Podgagement offers. That is my favorite feature, is the ability to collect voicemails from people. You send them to a landing page or eventually embed something on your website, and your audience could record a voice message for you. So it's not always your voice in your podcast, but some of your audience's voice in your podcast, responding to things that you said, sharing feedback for you, sharing theories, pointing something out, asking a question, anything like that. That starts to get really exciting. And here's the real power in that a lot of people don't realize. When you can directly engage your audience, and this, by the way, is something that we indie podcasters can do better than anyone else because we're not big-time podcasters. We don't have a huge team. We're not locked in an office where we record the audio and then leave and touch the podcast. Never after that. We are deeply connected with our content, and we can deeply connect with our audience by engaging with them. And when you do that, you turn that audience member that you've engaged with, you're turning them into a super fan.
Ooh.
So they they will be more likely to stick around on your podcast, more likely to stand up for you, and what can really help you grow is more likely to promote your podcast to other people. Because it still happens today, the whole, Mom, I'm on the radio, I'm on the TV. That same kind of thing happens with podcasts too, of, hey, you got to listen to this. They played my feedback. That's my voice you hear on there. Or they're answering my question. They used my theory. They talked about my idea on their podcast. And they start telling other people and they say, you got to listen to this. Here, listen, see, right here. This is where they listen. That's my voice. That's my voice there in their podcast. That's the celebrity I follow, celebrity to them. Yeah. And you're turning them into evangelists for your podcast by engaging them, by including them. And that is so powerful because the number one way, we've said this for years, and recent surveys have confirmed this with actual data. The top way people discover podcasts is recommendations from people they trust, whether that's friends or even podcasts they listen to.
That is so true. I also heard another fun fact is that podcasting is usually not, there's no algorithms pushing out podcasts to people to listen, usually on the apps anyways. Well, versus like YouTube, there's lots of algorithms, YouTube and Instagram, things like that, Facebook. It's all algorithm based, I guess, so to speak. And podcasting, at least at its core with the apps that we have today, usually are not that. So Podgagement, the thing I find fascinating about it is that you said that you will pull reviews, not just reviews, but rankings. There's a lot of different ranking systems out there. Will you pull all of them together?
Yeah, I pull all of those. Now, right now, although I am tracking some of the ratings, the rankings and charts, I'm not yet displaying that, but I've been pulling that data for years. It's just deciding how to display years worth and literally more than a terabyte of data to podcasters.
And there's a lot of different places that rank things differently, I think. So I don't know which ones you would use as the Apple ones, but even with an Apple, there's like different countries. They've all got their own. I don't even know how I even access that stuff, to tell you the truth. But with
that's the other thing. Yeah, with you think about, you might be in the United States and you have listeners in the United States and in Canada, but in order to see those reviews, if they leave a rating or review in the Canadian store, that is not displayed in your
What?
US listing in Apple Podcasts. So on your iPhone, if you look at Apple Podcasts, you will see only the ratings and reviews that were left in your country's store. Through the Podcast Connect system, which is probably how you submitted your podcast to Apple, it is now possible to go in and switch between the different countries. But Chris, there are 175 different countries to switch to, and you have no idea even which ones have ratings or reviews, let alone if they are new. So it would take you 1,400 clicks. I counted this one time. 1,400
time for
clicks. Yeah, every day to do what I made Podgagement to do for podcasters automatically, to check nearly 200 places for ratings and reviews, collect those all in a single place for you, emailing you notifications if you want, or sending them through Slack or other integrations like that, so that you can stay on top of these reviews, thank the people who gave you ratings and reviews. And again, by thanking them, naming them, maybe even reading an excerpt of the review, and that alone inspires more people to give you more ratings and reviews, which gives you more feedback. It doesn't help you in the algorithms. I know there's a popular myth out there that ratings and reviews help you rank better. That's not true. But ratings and reviews are social proof, and they're basically testimonials giving you power to better promote your podcast and gives you ideas of ways that you can improve your podcast and better reach your audience. So they do help you to grow your own podcast. They won't grow your podcast for you, but you can use them. So Podgagement saves you all this time from having to go and check these places or copy and paste or embed these things or screenshot these things for you. Podgagement does that for you. It even now makes images. Like if you've got a review you really like, and maybe it's a long review, so you can't fit it into a single post somewhere, you could export an image, maybe a wide image, tall image, maybe for Pinterest, a square image for Instagram. You can do that to better engage your audience, show off your engagement that you have, show off some of your audience members and their feedback and their experiences. And again, turning them into superfans.
Nice, man. So with the Podgagement, when you do the reviews and everything, you package it all together. Can you make like a little cute little like media board? What do you call it? Like a media? What do you call the thing where they, I can't think of it, where you have all your stuff in one little package to like a
media kit.
Media kit. That's it. I'm sorry. I don't know. Yes, media kit. Like a nice little media kit showing off your podcast. Can you create that, or does it do it for you?
It doesn't do it for you yet, but that is actually on my list to do that kind of thing, because one of the things I'm working on in the future, there's so much I'm excited about doing. Because a little brief tangent here, the product for 9 years was called My Podcast Reviews. And that was very limited to, well, podcast reviews. It's right there in the title. And I wanted to do so much more with the product. So I rebuilt it from the ground up, gave it a new name, Podgagement, so it focuses more on engagement. And already I've launched a whole bunch of new features with it since it's almost a year now of the rebrand, and it has all kinds of new features. And that media kit idea is one of those things that I'll be able to, in the near future, pull in some of the stats from your podcast hosting provider, certain ones being supported, that is, and be able to build a media kit for you. Nice. Where maybe you could say, I want this media kit to always automatically display my most impressive numbers, my 4 and 5 star ratings and reviews, and how many countries my podcast is consumed in, and some of my top feedback. Or maybe it's something like in the interface, you can tag some of your ratings and reviews and feedback as those are your favorites. So maybe it's whenever you get a new one that you really like, you tag it and it automatically gets inserted into your media kit. And you could download that as a PDF, or maybe send people to a page that would be designed and branded for your podcast, where it has that always up-to-date information. That's coming. That's not available yet. But
that's
that
great.
is definitely coming, because as you can tell, I put a lot of thought into building this feature and what I want it to do for podcasters.
That'd be the one thing I would be really interested in, because, if you go through all the reviews, even if you got all the reviews or the whatever, you kind of find the right one. This one looks great. That looks great. But then you have to like organize it on like PDF page or some kind of something or other, make it look pretty and choose right fonts and choose right colors in the background and choose the right whatever, all that stuff, make it look presentable and all that. That takes a lot of work. And if you can create something that pulls all that together, something that's all done and ready to go, that you can show off to potentially maybe new clients or new listeners, or maybe even guests that you want to, to get on your show. You could even do that. Now, will you do things, speaking of guests, we have like in the media kit have like, I've interviewed this person, that person, this person on the media kit too?
I would love to add that kind of feature. It might be harder to pull in automatically, but there are some ways that could be done, well, especially supporting Podcasting 2.0 features, because I could look at your RSS feed and look at all of those occurrences of the person tag that are not you and your normal co-hosts, and then automatically pull those in. And maybe it could be the same thing where you see, okay, these are all of the past guests that I've interviewed, and you tag certain ones as these are the favorites. These are the ones I want to feature, and those automatically go into your media kit as well. I love that idea. Thank you.
Hey, you're welcome. Hey, patent pending. Hey, so, but yeah, I just think that like presentation, especially with podcasting, since there's no algorithm really pushing our podcast show out to people, it's kind of like word of mouth and a lot of reviews and a lot of different things. And all this stuff kind of helps out. And I think that having a good, presentation, a good package to kind of put in front of people, because people will say, what's your podcast about? You kind of explain to them or whatever, or you maybe even give them a business card or who knows what. But based on that one little impression, but if you had a whole package just put together very nicely and it pulled all those things together, like you said, like the countries and the reviews and all that stuff all together in a nice little format that's easy to digest when you glance at it and it looks pretty and it's easy for a podcaster to put together. I think a lot of us podcasters, a lot of indie podcasters, they do the show, they have fun doing it, but it comes to all the hard, gritty work like you're talking about, like, I don't have time for all that stuff, man.
Right. And that's one of the ways that we talked earlier about how niche podcasters can better position themselves and do things that big people can't do. What sets me apart from my competition, now, my podcast reviews, my original product, was the first online service of its kind. And since then, there have been some direct copycats, but some other people who have launched similar services and such. And yes, I now have competition with some of these different features. But I'll tell you, what separates me from these others, and maybe your audience can already tell, is I am passionate about podcasting and helping podcasters. I am a podcaster first. And so my perspective on helping podcasters comes from that background of I'm in the trenches with you. I want these features too. I use these features too. I talk to other podcasters all the time who want and use these features, and I listen to their ideas and I try to build things for them. And I also, there's some balance of this, of thinking kind of like the Henry Ford quotation of, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse, but instead he gave them a car. That kind of thing. I can also listen to some of that because I've worked with people. I also have a design background, by the way, graphic design and things. And I've worked with people who would say things like, can you make that text red? And I love that example because when they ask, can you make it red? My first response, I just outright want to say to them sometimes, no, I'm not going to make it red. But I try to approach it differently and kindly. I say, you want that to stand out, don't you? That's why they want it red. So it's not really they want it red. They want it to stand out. So what are ways that I can make it stand out instead of making it red? Or is making it red actually the best way to make it stand out? So it's certain things like that, thinking what is it that the podcaster actually needs or what can serve their needs better. Those are the kinds of things that I think set me apart and that I get excited about supporting podcasters, whereas most of my other competitors are business people first, data people first, advertisers first. They're focused on some of those things. And maybe they didn't even, or maybe never have had their own podcast before. But I've been in the trenches and I have the actual earned experience of a podcaster. And I also have design background and some of the stuff that helps me to better make these things for podcasters. Like when I launched this image maker feature for making not only images from your individual reviews, but also attractive promotional images for your podcast. So like you could have the cover art for your podcast, the title of your podcast, your name on it, and also it could say how many ratings in total that you have. So you can show off just with a simple image that your podcast has 100 ratings and it's an average 5-star rating for your podcast. You could show that off, and it is designed in a beautiful way so that you don't have to think about that, because as we've already said, ain't nobody got time for that.
That's right, man. We're busy. Most indie podcasters are working, one, maybe sometimes 2 jobs and then a podcast.
Yeah.
So it's, we don't got time to big budgets like the big guys do to spend money on marketing. Hey, you guys handle it. I'll talk. You guys handle the rest, kind of thing.
Right.
So I know I think a lot of YouTubers do the same thing too. I was watching some YouTube show and I was thinking there's no way they edit their show. There's no way. They just do their thing, they record, they do all their stuff, but there's no way they're doing the editing on this stuff. Somebody else is doing that. Now I'm not that far along yet, but someday, live the dream,
Oh yeah. Yeah, it is nice to hand off that responsibility. But yeah, most of us are doing these things ourselves. And sometimes we don't have the time. Sometimes we don't have the skills to do some of these things ourselves. And that's especially, I think, a lot of podcasters don't have design skills to make certain things look good. And that's not a fault of their own. Oftentimes, I don't think they should need to know these things. Just like when it comes to podcasting 2.0, I really think podcasters should not need to know the actual code that makes it possible and the RSS tags and some of that technical stuff. They just need to be able to see, here's a field, fill in this information, and it will do these really cool things and this magic inside the podcast apps. Or like on Podgagement, you click these couple toggles, you fill in this information, and it gives you this beautiful image for your podcast.
Exactly. Well, Daniel, this has been so fantastic having you stop by today, man. I really, really appreciate you giving me your time today, man. So where can everybody find out all about you and all your wonderful stuff and Podgagement?
If you want to listen to my podcast about podcasting, I've got hundreds of episodes out there right now, currently on hiatus because I am also a full-time single dad homeschooling my son while running a business. So the podcast is when I can publish it, but the podcast is available at theaudacitytopodcast.com. And for Podgagement, I've invited Chris to my Podgagement affiliate program. So what I'm going to say is look at the notes for this episode and click on his link that will take you to podgagement.com. But click on his link so that he can earn a commission from referring you to Podgagement if you want to sign up. And if you just want to connect with me, I'm on most social accounts as the Daniel J. Lewis.
The Daniel J. Lewis. What does J stand for, by the way?
Joseph.
Okay. All right. Making sure. It's so cool when someone's got like a middle initial as a part of their official name, like Michael J. Fox or whatever, so that's pretty cool. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming by today. I really appreciate you stopping by.
Chris, it was so great to talk with you. Thank you.
Wow. That was fantastic. So great. We learned so many cool new things about indie podcasting 2.0, and of course, all about the cool new Podgagement. And if you want to use Podgagement, you can use my affiliate link, which will be down below in the show notes of this very episode and probably every single episode from here on out. My affiliate link will be right down there to Podgagement. If you want to get involved, you want to learn more about your podcast, and you want to be able to utilize every tool available in the podcasting community when it comes to reviews and all that wonderful stuff, get it all put in one place where you can track all this stuff all you want till your heart's content. Check out Podgagement. And you keep on making your amazing podcast. And until next time, happy podcasting.